Hey, good day, people. Happy holidays. Hope everyone is well. So I've been doing some dialogues with Guy Sengstock over on his channel on the Circling Dialogos channel. And if you haven't checked that out, please go check it out. I'm going to post a link to some of the earlier dialogues that we have done. And I am also going to link the one that we just did yesterday because, again, it was very interesting. If you haven't checked out his channel, please go to his channel, check it out, subscribe. He's doing some really great dialogues, a lot of interactions with other folks. And, in some ways he's doing the sort of old school kind of YouTubing, like philosophy from the ground up. So please, if you haven't checked it out, go check him out. And I hope you enjoy this and hope everyone is well. Okay, take care.
All right. So you're saying?
Okay, so yeah, what were we saying? Well, we were saying that there's a kind of ahistoricism that has been it's on many fronts, but it's been built into American culture, and it has to do in some sense with the loss of multi-generational like cohabitation around grandparents and aunts and uncles. And somewhere around the mid-century 20th century, lots of people on the promise of upward social mobility basically said goodbye to their family, and they moved across country, and they were going to, with them and the picket fence and the dog, they were going to raise the 2.5 kids. And a lot of kids then were raised not with their grandparents or their great grandparents or even aunts and uncles, and that loss of multi-generationality just accelerated the already happening technological change in the society. So, I mean, the technological acceleration, made for a lot of ahistoricism, but without getting at the loss of the multi-generationality, I think we sort of miss some of that dynamic. But like I said, I was very fortunate to have both my great grandparents kind of on the same road as my parents, and then my grandparents were, you almost see their house from my parents' house. And I basically, in some ways was raised, partly by my grandparents, and it makes me in some way like out of touch with some people who are my age, because I do have more of a bookish, and we were out in the sticks, so we didn't have MTV, we didn't have all that stuff that was happening for, I think, a lot of people who are my age. I'm 50, I'm 52. So, I mean, I think that sense of, things were, TV and cable TV and all that kind of stuff was really big for many people when I was that age, but I was more outside and with family and stuff.
So anyway, so in some ways I would imagine you can kind of maybe even kind of see it more, right? Because when you went off to college and you moved away, like in some sense, right, rather than just being born with cable TV, right, like you were able to kind of see it on some level. I would imagine that's maybe been helpful in getting a grip on the notion.
Weird, like I really like the book The Shallows by Nicholas Carr, but when he tells that the narrative of his experience with computers, again, it's just so different than my experience. And I like that book. And there's so much to be said about, what the internet's doing to our brain. And our brain is being rewired for this sort of light surfing across the just the shallow, bits. And we're really spread out, but we're not deep and slow thinkers. We're not really, we haven't learned to do that. We've lost some of that book culture. But I think his account was sort of like this. His father was really into, his whole family were into computers, and he remembers having a computer as a young person. I did it. I went away to college against my parents' wishes, where they went, you're not college material kind of stuff. I was sort of, and they gave me a typewriter that had, I think, a 16-character display on it. Like you could type it, you could see before they. I mean, we're some of the, we're of that last generation that remembers the big yellow phone in the kitchen with the long cord, and, like what life was like before the phone.
Right.
Even today, I mean, I have one of these. I got a flip phone.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Phone because those stuff.
Right. Here, I'm gonna take this off. Hang on one second, Mike. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the I'm looking at this book by Andre Murr. It's a death of journal. It's called Post Journalism: The Death of Newspapers, something along those lines.
Hmm.
And it's really interesting to me how Twitter is, the mortal enemy. It's an extinction event for journalism. It's not a challenge. It's just an extinction event. That Twitter has completely changed the way people understand news and news gathering and the
Yeah.
news function. And it's been an assault on journalism itself. I
Hmm.
mean, it's really Twitter is
Well, it put
fascinating.
journalists in a position where they have to compete, and then they're no longer journalists, really. They're marketers, and that's the tragedy. And I don't know any other way to do it. Like if I'm the newscasters, right? If like what's pulling everybody's eyes, and if their money is made and their survival is based on that, then they have to like all of a sudden have to have flashy titles, and where that just wasn't the case so many years ago, right?
Oh, yeah, no, it's very interesting, and it's I mean, I think the long short of it is that the culture is rapidly changing. I mean, I think that's the moral of what's going on is that I think humans have always been the most plastic of organisms,
Yeah.
but now culture is moving so rapidly that we're able to see some of the changes, the malleability of the human in like almost like live time. Like we're watching it happen in the way that most of it has been like either anthropological work or historical work kind of piecing together that people have lived very differently over the epochs or at different time periods, and now we're able to see it partly through communication media, but
Yeah.
partly in our own lives. I mean, relationships have really been changed because of the internet, because of cell phones, the
Right.
whole relation of how people do business, just all kinds of things have really,
Yeah.
solved.
Well, it shows just how, I mean, and this speaks, like deep into your work, which is, I mean, communication is at kind of the heart of everything, man. We, I'm rereading Walter Ong's book, his like, what is it? Is it literacy in the word or something like that? It's basic one about the shift from oral,
Or orality
writing.
and
Yeah, orality. Yeah, that one.
orality and
And
literacy. Yeah, that's a
it's so, I encourage everyone to read that book, right? Because it's just as an exercise of thinking, right? Of talk about what it takes to really kind of even comprehend what it was like to be in an oral society versus an alphabetic, right, literate society. It's not
yeah.
just one in which there was just the addition of a text and it's more convenient. No, it changed our consciousness, right?
Yes, that is. I mean, the chapter in there called "Writing Restructures Consciousness" is an absolute classic, and that book is a classic for sure.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think, yeah, not only is that a great call, but I mean, Walter Ong, he had coined a term called diachronic phenomenology, and he was critical of Husserl and Derrida and Heidegger,
Right.
a lot of the existential tradition that I was sort of more trained in,
Right.
and I found myself increasingly persuaded by his arguments, and I've tried further work on this notion of diachronic phenomenology that human consciousness has undergone significant transformations, and there's no more intimate way to transform consciousness than to change and transform the basic tools of communication.
Yeah.
That and when you moved toward literate noetics, that is the structure of memory, the way that conscious resources can be allocated and distributed, it really changes from oral noetics. Like oral noetics are grounded in a need for rhyme and repetition and rhythm. Like that's why song lyrics, we can remember a lot of song lyrics because they have so much repetition and rhyme in them. And so like even like advertising jingles are designed to be I guess useful or applicable to the widest possible audience, including the semi-literate. And so in a lot of cases, you get use of these kind of earwormy kind of repetition and rhythm and rhyme. And that's very important, again, for the oral noetics. But like right now, even though neither of us are using pen and paper, the actual gymnastics of of the utterance, the way that it's unfolding in weird syntax and sort of literate sensibilities. We're using abstractions in certain ways, tolerating novelty. All of this would be alien to the oral mind. So it's, yeah, as you're saying, it's not just the fact of writing things down and having paper and pencil. It's that the way thought thinks as it does becomes very different once it's learned to think in terms of words being visible and something that you can sit still and try to organize in space. They're not, the spoken word isn't spatially arranged. And I think what for him too, one of the real important points is that many people, they grew literate in their discourse, not from themselves being highly literate and reading and learning from reading. No, there's a big difference in this. Elizabeth Eisenstein has done so much good stuff on this. There's a big difference between learning to read and learning by reading. Learning by reading, actually very few people are able to do. Some people can. Most people, they can learn to read, and then when they start to read, they need other people's assistance in order to understand what it is they've read. I mean, yeah, Isaac Newton, perhaps. There were people who were self-educated, and there are people who can educate themselves through study, but it's a percentage. It's a small percentage of the population compared to the number of people who just kind of learn to read, and then they get what he calls lay literacy. So they go to church and they listen to the priest who's either reading aloud to them, and so the spoken word already is within a literate tradition, and it's unfolding according to sort of rules of grammar of writing rather than just spoken syntax. But then the preacher himself herself, they're generally highly literate, and so their habits of mind have already been structured by thousands of hours or many years of literacy, of experiences with reading and writing. And so a lot of people became, they learned to talk like a book in spending their times around highly literate people. It wasn't just simply from the act of reading and writing. So like even right now, as literacy rates are waning and you're watching TV and people are sitting around watching TV, they're much more caught in a literate tradition than they would realize, because the people who are speaking on TV, a lot of it was scripted. Sometimes people are reading cue cards. There's invisible infrastructure of literacy that's supporting the whole linguistic edifice there.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Totally. Well, just even being able to abstract the note, isn't it even being able to abstract out the notion of the self, context independent? Like, I think I saw something where maybe I heard about it through Ong, but I think I maybe saw it somewhere else too, where they were asking people who were illiterate, right, to talk about themselves. And they couldn't do it they could only do it within a story. They could talk about themselves they couldn't separate the sense of self independent from a narrative that it was embedded inside of. Whereas people who, and I would imagine this has to do with the act of what it takes to actually abstract at that level, even just your sense of self that's differentiated from its context or its narrative, right, on some level, it seems like that could only come about through literacy, right? Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to be said there. I mean, some of it is, for Ong, just sticking close with Ong. And I think, the support for your argument would be people like Eric Havelock. His book, The Muse Learns to Write, has wonderful stuff on the way the knower and the known were separated in the Greek tradition, partly through the onset of literacy. But I think like for Ong, it's really important to do some of this, like, really fine-tooth comb work on the difference between all the different forms of writing, and particularly like pictograms and ideograms and those forms of writing versus alphabetic script. Alphabetic script is unique in that you're now getting characters to represent the phonetic elements of speech, as opposed to using characters to represent either things or ideas. Like take a pictogram. Ong has great stuff on this, where if I have a picture of a bird and I use that as like a pictogram to mean either something like the bird that I can see, or maybe even something like the idea of flight, like metaphorically sort of extrapolated as a metonymy there. I think he would say that what you're doing is you're using a physical object, the picture of the bird, to represent another physical object, the bird that you can see. But when I use the letters BIRD to represent sound, bird, something else is radically going on. That is, when you learn to imagine something wholly invisible that's naturally evanescent event that has no inherent visible surfaces, it doesn't have any colors, and it inherently is an unfolding in time rather than a thing in time. It's an unfolding of time.
Right.
You're something very, very different. And when you're
that's really different. Yeah.
You're trying to learn to think about your speech as if it were a thing just in space that can be looked at, held still, grabbed from different angles, like it's a three-dimensional object. Yeah, that's completely different than using pictograms and just other forms of writing where you're using images, again, to refer to other things.
Wow. It just seems like there's this quality of, well, it's hard to, I mean, this is probably why, I mean, it demonstrates it probably why it's difficult to comprehend oral societies. And it's like, it's one of those things, it's weird. It's like one of those things of trying to comprehend what it was like is similar to like being able to see like for a second, see the shape in the painting or the little like gestalt image, right? You're able to see the old lady's face for a second, and then you look back and you're like, oh, I can't see it anymore. How do I see it again? Where is it? You can see the old lady's face come out. I noticed that it's very similar to try to go back and understand Ong, right? In that way of oral culture. It's at that level of like having to access. It's a completely different, it feels like a completely different place that you must sit with your perspective to comprehend it, right? Which I would imagine, and when like from my perspective now with literacy, which just mostly tells me I'm structuring the world at ways that I can't probably even see. To look back on like prior to literacy, it just seems like life was so much less abstract or a different level of abstraction and so much more embedded, right? And it starts to speak a little bit to what you're talking about. Like you and I we're at the precipice of a strange thing where of the species, I think it's fair to say that the species where we can have memories prior to the internet, right? And I think it's a very different thing when people grow up, right, with multiple capacities for identity, right? Like in even name distribution, right? And then being able to organize those identities in different, like, God, that there's just a whole other thing going on that I don't even think we can understand right now, right?
Yeah, it's way too, it's an infancy to really grasp what all of this is going to mean in 200 years, 300 years. Consciousness being radically restructured. We're being, some of it would be a lot of McLuhan language, but if literacy, alphabetic literacy in particular, was an explosive technology that radically detribalized people and introduced sort of like functional, autonomous individual agents, something like that, who then formed publics, created governments, this kind of stuff. It's now we're in what he calls the implosion, and it's radically retribalizing people. So people are being retribalized. You have, instead of it being tribes based in geography, it's now tribes based in ideology. It's Coca-Cola Nation, it's a political party, it's religious affiliation, it's all these different kinds of, I'm one of these kind of people. Again, I think Ong just has such rich, again, support for all the things that you were just saying. He talks about the literate word versus the spoken word, and he says the spoken word is always a modification of a total context that's more than verbal. Speech always occurs in a context, and it's a modification of a total context that's more than verbal. Whereas the written word, it gives what Hirsch calls it, context free, or a context autonomous discourse. It sort of floats along, where you know, when we're thinking about what we're going to say to one another, we're like imagining like possible interlocutors maybe who aren't here right now. Whereas I think, yeah, in the oral mind is so geared toward the particulars where, like here'd be a different way to say it, that the oral mind, it's sort of like the speech itself is an expression of like the person and of the attitude and the character, and so much of it has to do with feeling and are you with me or you're against me. So
Yeah.
I'll speak things in a certain feeling kind of way, and my feeling is the dynamic part that's really the most important part, and are you with me or against me in terms of how I'm feeling about something. That's
Yeah.
the oral sensibility, and
Huh.
it's often caught within contestation and this kind of, you know, antagonistic forces. Whereas the literate mind, like the two of us could be sitting here and it's almost like we're disattending to the voice, we're disattending to all of the particulars of facial expression, animation, and we're just trying to abstractly think about the content being conveyed between us. Like we're denuding all of the existential gesticulating
Wow.
animal from the event and trying to think about it as it could be represented if it were just written down and we were reading a transcript. You know, we learn to interact like we can have an argument in a very civilized way. Well, I do say, sir, I'd beg to disagree with the position you've been offering, and we're doing this kind of stuff. You know,
Right.
it's so
Right.
on this again, this very abstract character that's
Yeah.
removed from the gesticulating animal feeling and looking for
Yeah.
confirmation of alignments with it itself or not.
Wow. This brings something to light. You're starting to, like, what you're pointing to has been what I've been trying to figure out for a long time, which on some level been trying to figure out what my profession is, right? Which is circling, but what actually it is, like why it's spreading, why people are attracted to it, like, and that hasn't been so obvious to me, but I'm starting to realize, and I think you're pointing to it. Circling is basically a relational practice, and it's even that I'm really starting to see it as like, well, that it is a relational practice, but it also points to the time that we're in, and it's precisely that kind of non-abstract encounter, right, with the other, and that kind of like attuning into the feeling. Are you with me or are you against me? All of those kind of like, like embodied, embedded, right? The dance of relation, like where I'm from, and especially because I'm from Chicago, I'm from the Midwest too. So I have like my grandparents had a few generations back, right? I had aunts and uncles that lived there my whole life. So there's a kind of sense in which there's more of that in my history than people who, like, say, or grow up in the internet, right? So I had a hard time actually understanding why circling really, really evolved to be a I thou practice, because it's isolating that, right? To stay in that, like a yoga, right? The I thou and that embedded, embodied kind of sense to things. And I think you could only have that with the internet, because I think the internet, and I think it actually started, like, I think it literally started probably with the answering machine, right? Where there's now a division or a break, or it becomes an option that if you want to have a two-way exchange, you can eliminate the embodiment aspect. You can leave a message on the answering machine, right? And of course, now that's in text, right? There's all these different ways in which, when you uncollapse, um, like communion from communication, right? And you make that optional. Well, communion's really awkward, right? If you think about how much ambiguity is involved, right? And in the normal conversation, it's intensely complex, right? And there's so much
Yeah.
vulnerability just in the most simple conversation. So if you can eliminate that, or make that an option, people are just going to text. They're just going to email rather than have that actual lived exchange. However, if you look at, well, how do you even know who you are? But through those kind of living exchanges with your parents and your community. And like, so if you consider how forming they are to personhood, right? Those exchanges, and then you make them an option, right? Then you're going to end up, then you start to have this situation with circling where it's very interesting, where circling becomes like the gym is for the body, right? Where before there were really such a thing as a gym before the Industrial Revolution, right? It wasn't until, right, we had to like functioning, we took away movement from functioning. Then all of a sudden our bodies became something completely different that we had to have gyms for. So in a similar way, that's starting to happen in terms of relationship. And I think I'm at the center of it with circling and just kind of responding to it and trying to make sense of it. But this really gets at that, right?
Interesting stuff. I mean, I think, for McLuhan, the media ecology tradition, they would say, the key break happened, mid 1800s with the telegraph. And because you had a separation between communication and transportation. Before that, transportation and communication almost ran concurrent, but suddenly now you could have a message travel faster than the messenger. And, okay, there were smoke signals and other things, but in general, you had carrier pigeon, or you had by rail or by horseback. I mean, again, transportation and communication were somewhat synonymous. The telegraph radically severed that, and it led for, again, increasingly decontextualized information, like news from nowhere that people didn't understand its relevance. And, I think, what you're sort of getting at again is this sort of wonderful way in which people are yearning for this recovery of the negotiation of identity in face-to-face ways with the multi-leveled, multi-channeled, multimodal kind of communication that we can have. I think of people like Alfred Schutz with his notion of growing older together, that there's such a difference between a text where I send one to you and then you send one to me, and we're sort of texting back and forth, versus right here. Now, we're not face to face, so this is not really meeting Schutz's definition, because we'd have to be fully face to face, but we're at least having the sense of being in a shared time where our interaction is allowed to sort of unfold spontaneously with regard to what the other person just said. And so we're having all the kind of dynamic. I want to be, before we go on to this, I just got to get this in, is that I think part of the issue of how this came about was that before, it used to be the phone was in the kitchen. We all had the big yellow phone in the kitchen with the long call house, right? When you called their house, you knew what you were doing. Then and again, you were calling their house, and you had a sense of what time it was. Was it dinner time? Was it not? But once you had cell phones, now you no longer called a resident, you called a person. And because you'd have the phone on them, it felt like such an interruption to call someone. People were like, I can't talk. I'm in the middle of a meeting. I'm doing this. So texting became the next go-to, because it was a way to keep in contact with someone, knowing that you're reaching a person rather than a location, but it wasn't as interruptive. And I think a lot of people tried to deal with that space, but they ended up with really, not the kind of relationships at all that they wanted. I think, one of the ways to get at that is like, if you're hanging out with your friends or, your significant other, you could just be sitting quietly on the couch, just kind of watching the grass grow. You're just sitting there. That's the relationship. But when a relationship's been reduced to texting, you start to you text and I text and you text and I text, and we start to feel like relationship is all this work all the time. Like, unless we're actually doing the communicating in the labor of it, we're not really in a relationship. And you feel like going, oh, well, no wonder young people are so exhausted by relationships, because they align relationships with all this kind of texting back and forth. They don't know how to just be with one another. They don't know how to just hang out.
And you said, there's one thing that you said you did I think it ended up being one of your most popular videos, was on where you were talking about Facebook, and you hadn't been on it and went to go check it out, and you're reporting back on what you thought of it. And then I thought it was really brilliant the way that you started to talk about the sense of the break in the continuity, right, with the body. And then the self-confiscation, where you talk about, you kind of leave the reference point of being a body, of the flow of time happening as your body, to being an other for other, right? And then you drew this connection between self-confiscation, right, and the yearning, and then the identification with being an other for another, and then Facebook being, in this example, Facebook being I got the sense of like the narcissistic play on making sure of that that who I am in your mind is who I think I want to be for you, right? And that's how I know whether or not I am, versus this kind of this like loss of embeddedness in your environment.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I guess I would say that, for me, the best source on that is Morris Berman, his book, Re-Enchant the World, where he talks about the basic fault. And yeah, we lose that somatic who we are as a body. And we start to identify with what he calls the specular image. Yeah, how I'm seen with others. And I think that's, in some way, it's a normal process in developmental psychology that we learn to be aware that we can have food on our face, or our pants needs to be tucked in, even though it's behind us. So we start to learn, again, that not just that there are other people, but that we're others for others. But I think, what happens is that where, for Mead and some of the early psychologists and philosophers of self, he would talk about the generalized other. So I start to generalize an other of, and I start to police my behavior according to what I think people in general would esteem or approve. And I start to think about myself in those generalized terms. And Facebook becomes a kind of institutionalized, generalized other. But the problem is that, it's no longer behaviors and characters and qualities of self. It largely is a series of surfaces and images of attitudes and postures. It's like or not liking it. I mean, that's so funny. Like things on Facebook. You don't say why you agree or why you disagree. You don't give reasons and try to clarify. You give a thumbs up.
Right. Totally. Yeah. So it's like well, this is kind of this is what's just so interesting to me about this sense of being an other for other. And I get what you're saying. You're right. There seems to be a normal developmental sense in which you do part of, I'm sure it has something to do with brain development too, of being able to abstract out that, like, actually there's a guy over there that if I don't know that you hate me, right? If I'm not tracking that, right, I'm not going to be able to be attuned to you, right? Let alone to what's happening. So there's a sense in which, but I think what you were pointing to is not that. It was like, when that becomes the only source of my identity, right?
Yeah.
Of that, when I become completely identified with being my thought about your thought about me, right? That becomes a real different game.
You were talking, I think, one of your earlier videos about double bind and some of Bateson's work, and like Bateman and Jackson, their book Tentative Axioms of Human Communication. The book is called Pragmatics of Human Communication, but the chapter in there is called Tentative Axioms. And it goes back to this discussion we were having about the difference between the oral and the written sort of sensibilities, because what they would say is that, and again, it's coming off of Bateson's work, but that when you spoken message, like as we're talking back and forth right here, right now, it's not as if there's just a message being sent. It's that by way of facial expressions, by tone of voice, by levels of distance and inclusiveness, inclusiveness, all these different dynamics, a multimodal, multi-channel sort of thing going on, that we have something like, at the very least, there's a content, there's like what we're talking about, but then the relationship level of like how we're managing our relationship independent of whatever we're talking about at all. And they say that there's at least 3 meta level messages that are accompanying any message, no matter what people are talking about. And those 3 messages are something like, this is how I see myself. This is how I see you. This is how I see you seeing me. So here's an example, right? You're at a party, right? And it's a fancy party. People are carrying around like shrimp and this kind of stuff. And you see a woman approach another woman, and she comes up to her and she says, "Are those real pearls?" And then later you see another woman come up to that exact same woman at the party and go, "Are those real pearls?" Now the exact same message was sent, but how it was sent, the tone, the facial expression, the demand, the deference, all of those things are weighing in and accomplishing a very different kind of relationship level of something, very different senses of, this is how I see myself, this is how I see you, this is how I see you seeing me. And I think we as literates, we can like disentangle that and go, there was what was said and how it was said and the gesture. Whereas I think for the holy oral mind, the entire thing is an event and how you meant it is what comes across. And that's what you experience. You're like, person's a bitch. Person was so nice to me.
Right.
I just
Totally.
put it in.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
They're experiencing the particulars of the event in terms of the overall meaning that they take from it. We're here disentangling all the elements in a very abstract way, trying to think about situations where right now we're talking about cocktail parties that are non-existent in the abstract. There's these fictional people. Yeah, I think this, you look at, Luria's work on illiterate peasants in Russia. It's so interesting. Like they would say to the peasants, so Novoya, he lives up in the north. And in the north, there are only white polar bears. Novoya sees a polar bear. What color is the polar bear? And they'd go, I didn't see it. And they were like, well, no. And, it's like they kept trying to give like these logical syllogisms. And some people, they extrapolated from it something along the lines of illiterates were unable to think abstractly, and other people came in and went, no, you're inferring much too much. It's that they didn't accept the speech genre of, just abstractly entertaining things without having seen it themselves with the particulars.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Wow.
That's very funny.
Wow. So how is this? So this is one of the things that I just thought as we're talking about, right? It starts to get it to your latest book. Congratulations, by the way. It's congratulations.
Thanks.
What's the title of it again? It's
not being haunts being.
Not being haunts being, right?
Being right here it is. I got my copy here. There it is.
All right on. Congratulations, my friend.
Thanks. It's subtitled on possibilities, morality, and death acceptance.
Oh, okay, got it. So one of the things that I know that I've been talking a lot. This just keeps coming up on with most of the people that I've been talking with on the channel and in my work and everything, which is this experience of nothingness, right? This sense of nihilism, right? What that is, right? The kind of the loss of like the nothing being the not or the absence, but also this possibility that I think maybe, and I'm just curious what you think about some of this stuff, but which is this kind of, for example, this notion of sunyata, right? Where it's really about it's something different than just nothingness, or it's nothing with a different angle on it, right? Which seems to be actually grants a kind of profound, like the deepest sense of the meaning in a certain regard, right? And those, I think all of this really connects there. But I think I would imagine that one of the things that comes up for me, and this is where we started talking in the beginning of this conversation, was recently helping my mom move to one of these retirement communities and thinking about well, here she's confronting the ultimate nothing. And it makes sense for her and our culture, as it does for a lot of people, to move into this. It's like literally a simulacrum, right? It's a Disneyland, right? Where they go around in golf courses and everything is built to look like something that doesn't actually exist, right? But it's kind of built, and then people kind of go die there, right? This just starts to get at the heart of this sense that I think is in some sense is haunting most of the people that not many people have. I don't think that many people have this sense of they're talking about nihilism explicitly, but I keep hearing them talk about it, right?
Yeah.
It's underneath our everything, right?
Yeah. I'm trying to do my argument would be that you can fully accept death without sliding into nihilism. Good. And it does do with a kind of recovery of a certain understanding of what one means by non-being or absence. And I think there's a family resemblance of a whole host of different kinds of and related phenomena. So I don't think there is like just one thing, like nothing or non-being, and they're all just, different variations of the same thing. No, there's like family resemblances among and across a whole host of different phenomena. Everything from like thirst and the sense that I haven't had enough to drink lately, or that I need food, like metabolism is its own sort of incompleteness in relation to what I'm not, but my own dreamless sleep, my own, headlessness. Like I really love Harding's stuff on the headless way. I think that's some of the, just best stuff, which is very much aligned with the sort of Eastern, orientation, yada, this kind of stuff. But here would be a very simple way to think about it. And I know that you had seen some of the videos because you had some comments on some of them that we were sort of chatting back and forth in the comments section. But it's like in my world, because I'm always here in my world, I've never not been in the world that I'm walking around in. Like I can be aware of the fact that there was a world before I was born, but that's not the world that I'm directly aware of. The world that I'm aware of is that world that's always already included me, right? So it's like it's sort of like it's there, and I can experience lots of forms of absence. Like I can go, oh, my phone's not in my pocket. I left it upstairs. Or I look and I go, oh, my keys aren't in the drawer. Or I can have these senses of like actual noticing absences in the world. And then I can start to think about that ultimate absence, which I can never experience because it's unthinkable. But I think we can, if we're honest, we can feel it's on the cusp of consciousness, which is that I will not be at some point. Like, I can think about other people dying. I just had a close friend die, and it's so hard. I notice her absent here, but I'm not going to notice my own absence when I'm gone. I'll be dead. I won't.
Yeah.
But right now I can think, or I can't think the thought of what my own death will be, but I can infer from senses like what my own dreamless sleep was, what it was like, like where was I before I was born? I wasn't worried about the passage of time there, and I think there's a big difference between never having been born and no longer existing. I think those are qualitatively different. I mean, I do think there's a sense in which, however massive or minuscule, those who have entered existence, they make their mark, whereas those who have never existed are nothing other than an imagination in other people's like minds. There is no person there.
Right.
David Benatar has a great book called, it's a very interesting book called Better Never to Have Been, where he tries to lay out antinatalist philosophy, which I'm not an antinatalist, but I've learned a lot from that, and I think it's a great foil to a lot of pro-lifers. But in there, he has a wonderful line where he says, there is no person who is lucky enough to have never been.
Yeah.
There is no person who is lucky enough to have never been. And I think his point is that non-persons can't not be there. There's nothing there.
Yeah.
So you can't have a harm. You can't deprive a benefit from a non-existing person.
Yeah, totally. Like is like Rilke, I think in the Dueno eulogies, like he gets at this by exalting those who have died young. Essentially, like he talks a lot about that in the eulogies of like praising the sense of the ones who died young or the ones we see, like we crave to be on some level, right? And I think it starts to get at that.
Yeah. I mean, if I had to like, boil it down or something like this, I'm very skeptical of religious dogma and of scientific dogma. And the religious dogma, which basically says you have free will, but only because God gave you free will, because this is a big trial and you're going to understand it all afterward when you're facing God and judgment is served, all this kind of stuff. And then on the other hand, get like the scientific view, which is sort of, the physicists are going to explain to us eventually how it's all epiphenomenal and that free will or agency or choice are just illusory. And I'm kind of a ping pong ball on water, just following out, the concatenated causal sequences that are pushing me along from the past. And I'm like, no. I think we can find room for real agency and for real accountability, and however humble it is, but it has to do with the way the body folds back upon itself, that relations are as real as things, although they're not things. And there has to be a kind of non-being infecting the world. And it allows for questions. It allows for the deliberation of what not to do. Like we have the word no and don't and the thou shalt nots of the Bible. I mean, all of these ways of like negativity with language, they open a time in which I can deliberate and say, should I say yes to the thou shalt not? Should I say no to the thou shalt not? I can think about possibilities. And once I have those capacities, I have agency. And, and I guess, on the other hand of this, I'm trying to argue against the, and I know it's controversial, but I'm arguing against this notion of like a metaphysical soul that's going to go on after you're dead. I kind of feel like people are underestimating who they are while they're alive. They're this radical emptiness. They're the headlessness that makes room for everything. You're a place and moment of the world worlding. You're not a thing just on a world representing a world that goes on independent of you. Some of the world can't even be what it is without your assistance. Yeah. You're the world is worlding. You're something it's doing.
Right.
Same with other people. Right. I think people understand themselves as partly other people, as they could only be who they are with others' assistance, that others can't be who they are without their assistance. And we start to realize ourselves as part of the earth, as partly other people, as socio-historically constituted. All that other stuff just starts to wash in insignificance. And I think there's a new kind of deep gratitude for having been invited to the banquet of all banquets, life itself. Yeah. I mean, what people want.
Right.
All of this, like, what do you think you get to have for knowing all that to be able to have experienced all you've experienced, to watch nature shows and to just be astonished at all the complexity of nature and life, and to hold a lover's hands and to taste fruit and all this kind of stuff. You think you should get all of this and then also an afterlife? Who do you think you are? I mean, I think people, just be grateful, go praise for having been and having known this is death, with death acceptance as the ultimate gratuity.
Yeah.
Be gracious and grateful for having known that there is such a thing as this. And even if global climate change wipes us all out, we talked about this before, you're always already more than you could ever achieve or accomplish.
Yeah.
Yes. And yet people need to understand that at a deep level. Yeah. I think they could, maybe stop holding themselves hostage out of anger over the fact that they're self-aware and finite, and maybe start caring about other people a little bit more. It ain't about you. It ain't no big test rehearsal for you and about, the entire culture is all about, it's me. It's all about me. It's all about, in my, it's just bizarre. I remember my grandmother saying stuff like, well, when I die, I got questions, and boy, I'm going to get my questions answered. I'm like, no, it's never going to happen, Grandma. You're never going to get your questions answered, And people they claim to love God, and yet they don't like other people. Like they think God is a white man. Oh, Jesus was white, and well, why would God have a certain skin color, but then not have his son be the same skin? They have these ridiculous horseshit ideas about God. And God sits and he has feet and has a penis. All this kind of ridiculous. A man, and it's absurd. But I'm not an atheist. I'm not. Right. I don't. Then I completely disidentify with the atheist. And I would just go, you need a very simple argument, which is everything we see is caused by something. I am not the cause of myself. Other people brought me into existence, and we go back, but there has to be at a certain point something that was not caused by something else. You get a non-contingent ground of being. You just postulate it logically and go, there has to be something that is a non-contingent ground of being. Let's just call that God. You don't need dogma. You don't need virgin births and talking snakes and divine intervention and afterlives. You just need to go, there's something inherently logically paradoxical about, you need some ground point there. Otherwise it just gets confusing, and science calls it the Big Bang, or the singularity that was there prior, the pure symmetry that was broken, whatever. There's different ways that people could talk about it, but that's, for me, that's all you need. You need an orderliness, and that orderliness can be intelligent. You don't have to have a being. It doesn't have to be sentience. Orderliness can be intelligence. Take math. Math is a kind of supreme intelligence, but it's nothing other than orderliness. And it's a symptom of the orderliness of the universe.
Yeah, totally. Really liked everything you just said. And I got the sense as I follow that, like that line of just that sense in which, like, I think it's literally true, ontologically speaking, isn't it? It's like I know, I'm reading this book right here right now too. Of course, I always got 8,000 books going on at once, but this one where
Love it, man. I love the early Heidegger. I'm so about the early Heidegger. His stuff on exhibitive disparting in there. He's got some great stuff on predication. Yeah.
Well, in this one, he just really kind of lays it out where he just shows that the problem of Dasein, right, of human, essentially the being of human being, is essentially the same problem of transcendent itself, right?
That's right.
Right. And I think that starts to another way. I think you say that in another way when you say, like, our being is already always the nothing that haunts, right?
That's right.
I think in your first book, you say it in the sense, I think you say it the sense that we are the, like we haunt the earth, right? We decompress the darkness of the earth in a certain sense and open it to its own horizons, and it becomes a world, right? All these ways of getting at this relationship with nothing, right? This relationship with consciousness, right? Is so close to just the very heart of what we are, right?
That's right. That's right. When he talks about the being of beings, the being of beings is not a being, and the being of beings is inseparable from the nothing that nuts. I mean, I think for Heidegger, that only a being who could entertain nothingness could entertain the being of beings. Yeah, the being of beings has to entertain them as possibles. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the way that we actually experience the world. And I think that's right. It does have to do with transcendence. We're naturally the transcendent being. I mean, I think that book may even have the line. I'm not sure that. I think that may be the book that opens with the little epigram there. We are beings of distance. The human being is a being of distance. And I think you're right that consciousness is the exemplar. People want to say, well, what do you mean by nothing? Or what do you mean by non-being? Consciousness. I mean, when Sartre writes being and nothingness, and he basically says consciousness is being for itself rather than being in itself, and then he has to introduce this problem of being for others because it is a tripart ontology, and I think that's right. But yeah, if you say to people, is time real? They have a tendency to go, of course it is, if you say to people along, that same sense, if you say, is consciousness real? Oh, well, yeah, I don't know, but yeah, I guess consciousness is real. Then if you say, is nothing real? They go, oh, no, there's no such thing as nothing. Well, there couldn't be either consciousness or time without non-being.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that kind of as I was going to ask you about this, because I always felt that there's a space for a kind of ethics, it seems to me, right? And it's in that point in that video that I've always just really enjoyed of yours, where I think it's called Fear and Death or something. It's where you talk about, like, you present this, it's like 4 minutes long, and you present this dialectic between this sense of the obsession I think people have, right, with being someone, right? Like just the sense that you could justify your own existence by what you've contributed. And then you show the other side of that dialectic, which is when you say you're already more than you can ever accomplish, right? That video, I love that video because it starts to get at something, and where it's drawn a lot of my thinking, right, is in response to that yeah, when you get something like you're already more than you could ever accomplish, that what you are can't pay off the debt for that you are, right, in some sense. Then there's this way in which it's kind of like, well, and I think that you start to speak at, well, what is it though? It's like, well, you get to experience all of it, and you get to say what you think about it, right? That testimony to the, for what you could say, you are an unqualified clear, like you, you're an uncreated, unself-created clearing for the occurring world. It always sounds to me like, well, it seems like that there is an ethic in that, right? And the ethic is something like do everything that you can to be as a profound observer, right? To be a, I don't know, it seems strange. It's like it's a clumsy way of talking about it, but in some sense, it always struck me as like when I'm working with people in circling and we're talking, they're working at, and I'm teaching them try to be better listeners, right? To be more poetic in their understanding of something, like they're kind of the training and opening their senses, right? And all those kinds of things. I was thinking about that, well, why is that those kinds of aspirations, right, inherently, in some sense, transcendent, right, and almost religious, right, in implication, right? And I think it starts to get at this sense that you get at in that video, and I think probably in your book, like in pretty much all of your books, right, to me, which is not only am I the nothing, where all sub things get to happen within that horizon, right? Including myself, right? But that there are things that self can fold back on itself and have a deeper relationship to it. And what ends up showing up more, right, is others, right? This sense of being of service to the world, of being like more of a profound observer. And of course, you're like the depth of your the depth of your observation is going to show up into the depth of your responsiveness to what you see, right? In some sense. But I always kind of sense this, you can hear me kind of struggling with it, but I have always kind of felt like that there's a real place for a kind of ethics, I think, in that sense. Can you speak to that a little bit? What do you think about that?
Right. I mean, Joseph Campbell has some great commentary on this where he says that, Western religions and Eastern religions, they vary in a lot of ways, but one of the main sort of broad differences is that Western religions tend to be ethical religions, whereas, Eastern religions, they tend to be reorientations to self-understanding. They're trying to get people to, again, to understand themselves in a certain way. Whereas I think Western religions have a tendency to give a lot of prescriptions about do's and don'ts and this kind of stuff. I guess I do think there is an implied ethics, which is it has to do with the kind of openness that comes and a kind of gratitude and a recognition of oneself as on loan to oneself and trying to be a good steward to what one's like when one is a trustee to a kind of cause that's beyond oneself. And, you're a steward to it. And I think the more that one realizes how much they're indebted to others, there's a kind of liberation that comes through that recognition of the indebtedness.
Yeah.
And it sounds so silly, but in some way it's about sharing and taking turns. It's about sharing and taking turns. It's so simple in ways. They've lost their sense of who they really are. They think they're too, they become too big for their britches. They think it's all about them. And I think if they would have a deeper, more honest sense of self-understanding, they give up on some of these like phony, chintzy forms of transcendence, which is, you have keys to the executive toilet, or, you have a fancier title than someone else, something like this. And they'd be really interested in those robust forms of transcendence, contemplating the ideal, growing themselves in spiritual potency, again, seeing how much they can open to others in that sort of loving struggle of difference. I mean, there's so many different avenues to chase it out. But I mean, I think, some of it is that some people are trapped with a kind of love of money and a kind of greed that isn't a selfish greed as much as it's a scared animal trying to be important, when it's bought a narrative that it's this shrimpy little sack of skin. And so it's already trapped in a trivialized sense of self. And then we end up, trying to give this ethical shake about, don't be so greedy and don't do this and don't do that. Whereas I think if instead of trying to tell people what they should and shouldn't do, instead you really help them understand themselves differently, right behavior just flows out of it.
Yeah, right. Because we can't not, that's one of the things about it. If you are on some level of, if like ontologically speaking, I'm always already running ahead of myself, right? And beings happen in a horizon that I, in some sense, provide, right? And I don't identify with one of those as like one of those things, but I identify more with those horizons per se, right? There's a way in which you can kind of always, like, we could always say that we're really not things that then act, right? We're more like we find ourselves already in a response to an understanding, right? And that's, and so, because that's always been a sense in which I noticed with working with people, like, and coaching them and stuff. It's like, it's so interesting because I've noticed I can ask people who they are and they'll give really intelligent answers, but actually they really don't know until they respond, right? And and that's usually where all of that, we actually find out who we are, is like, you do something, you have some goal and you start heading towards it, and everything that gets in the way, the obstacles, which is the path, right, gets in the way. And like, of course, as a coach, what I'm there to do is basically have a conversation with them when they hit that obstacle, to relate with it more profoundly, right? And always the response is that usually the obstacles that they partake have one to do with like deep senses of self-identification, right, that get challenged in those things, right? And if the overcoming of them has so much to do with them kind of starting to own, in some sense, what what they couldn't own about themselves, but they start to learn what they understand, who they are, not by what they think about it, but by dealing with the breakdowns, right, in all the relations, right, that's calling to them, reveals all of their limitations, all of their, in terms of how they understand the world. And so you end up, it's really cool, because you end up having these profound conversations that actually them accomplishing some goal that they want. What they actually have to do is they have to realize themselves through the process, right? Through all of that.
I think so much of that Sartre, I think of Bakhtin, Bakhtin's sense that, we don't really coincide with ourselves. We look at other people, they look like they coincide with themselves. Whereas for ourselves, we're always, there's some project still outstanding.
Yeah.
It's this so well that, and this is why existential psychoanalysis has such, value, because people struggle with what they're doing with themselves, with how their lives matter and to whom and to what degree. And there is always this sense of, well, now what will you do? And you say, well, I don't know, I'm going to have the weekend off. And they say, well, what will you do with your weekend? You say, I don't know, I just want to make it to retirement. Well, what will you do with your retirement? And it's not just this like American, busy, you have to be productive sort of stuff. It's more the sense in which we always have this sense of, there's still something outstanding that I'm going to have to deal with these possibilities, including ultimately how I'm going to die, and how is that going to go down? And it's, when you go to like oncology wards where people have, they just received you have stage 4 cancer. No one wants that diagnosis. No one wants to hear it, but I think more than people realize, it's a different response than I think some people think that they're going to hear that and they're going to be just like panic, like, oh no, I'm dying, I'm freaking out. And there is that, but there's also this like, there's this like deep relief of, I am not responsible for doing something with my life anymore. Like there's this whole relief of like, I'm officially in the stages of I'm dying. Everyone else can just screw off. My priorities are very clear right now.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm just, I want to talk with my friends, get my stuff in order. And there's this, again, there's still stuff outstanding, but the burden of life, life is this massive burden of what will I do with myself? How will I, and it's this transcendence, this time issue. I'm time. So how will I pass time? Philip Zimbardo's got such great stuff on, addiction, and addiction being time disorders, because people don't know how to pass time. And whether you want to go to Zig Mahali stuff on flow and getting lost within things and the time just disappears, or you could talk about the way that we feel the drag of time and boredom, and boredom can just be so painful because time just sort of stands still. Yeah. There is this sense of which we're being these possibilities, which means that we're sort of open to the non-being there. We're open to the nothing.
Yeah. Right. And that way of being open to the nothing starts to get at everything. So interesting. Right.
Yeah. I mean, Heidegger hits at it so well in those early lectures where, I think in a lot of his like formal writings, not the lectures that he gave, like, when he did the Kant book and when he did the What is a Thing and some of these other stuff, I think he was still committed to like anxiety being the true mood that discloses non-being. But I think the earlier part where his earlier writings where he's talking about boredom, he didn't do enough with boredom. I think boredom, like profound boredom, what are you bored by? Well, it's nothing. There isn't anything in particular that's boring. It's like the whole of everything, which whole in addition to the things. Well, sure, the whole is nothing.
Right. And we start to look at Tulsa, I'm wondering, so this kind of sense of nothing, right? This deep sense that we're talking about, and love. Like I had a friend that talked about this, is that, in some sense, like this kind of this openness that we are, this nothing that we haunt the world with, right? He really made this connection, right? Like really what that makes room for is a kind of unconditional kind of love, right? Through all of that. And I'm just wondering, like, what is the connection? Do you have much of a connection to love through some of this?
I mean, I guess this goes back to, if I think of you as an object and you're just a thing in the world, my love for you is very different than if I see you as an opening of possibilities. That is, Sartre is so good on this, where he talks about when we want the love, we want the love of a free subjectivity. We don't want the love of an object. We want the love of the other that's freely choosing to love us back. So, I mean, the sense of freedom and non-being and love are somewhat made synonymous there. That if you weren't free, at least in some way, we don't have to talk about some super metaphysical freedom like from on high. We're just talking about the ability to deliberate possibilities and choose among those possibilities, meaning some of them will not be actualized, and that's a fact, right? Love only happens under those conditions, that without some kind of possibility of being withdrawn, without the possibility of it disappearing, without it being fragile and finite, I don't think it could be real. Now, again, you can have like religious people go, oh no, there's an infinite love and it's boundless. And we could talk about, is orderliness a kind of intelligence that we're going to call love or beneficence or something? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Life is horrible. It's a horrible, beautiful spectacle. It's not all rainbows and kittens and puppies and this kind of stuff. I think we're witness to the majesty of it, but it's a horrifying majesty. It's absolutely horrifying. I mean, Jesus Christ, we're fancy worm food and we're going to die one day.
Right. And that week just struck me about, like, for some reason, as you're talking about both the horror and the innocence, I just kept seeing I noticed I kept picturing someone's face and the eternity. Like, how you can see someone's life in their
Yeah.
face, right? There's a way in which an old person's face, like there is you can see all the sunsets in some level. You can see everything that was timeless about them, that they lived through time. That
I mean, I think in some way, like the spiritual, for me anyway, like some of the spiritual message is,
Mhm.
can you, and this is Joseph Campbell, right? Can you joyfully participate in the sorrows of humanity? I mean, this is the Christ image, the Christ myth, right? You take a person who's done nothing wrong, who's been wrongly accused, humiliated, unjustly treated, and the whole time kind of goes through it and is able to accept this mistreatment. And it's sort of like, the ability to love even the horrors of the world is, it's almost like that. It's the experience, it's the spiritual register of the freedom that we have, that we can, despite it all, and go, oh my word, there's so much injustice and hardship, and everything from the kind of cruelties of the world, on differences of bodies being, born with disablements, and all that range from the sort of stupid social historical inequalities that we bring upon one another, but to be able to see it and to also say, man, it's horrible, but I still can affirm it, partly because of the ambiguity of it. I don't think we can round it out one way or the other. I don't think life is
exactly.
either bad. I think that's the illusion.
It's
It's beyond,
the infiniteness of the ambiguity, right? Which is, in some
you know,
sense, yeah,
line by Chorin says, we are much closer to God than God is to us. I sometimes imagine like a really huge circle, this massive, massive circle, and
yeah,
then this little, tiny, tiny circle inside the circle.
yeah,
Yeah, we're closer to God than God is close to us.
yeah.
If you want to have
Huh.
that sense of, I mean, I think there can be there's a radical asymmetry involved.
Yeah, yeah. But there is that, and there is that, there's something about it as we're talking, I'm just getting this sense of just this memory of just being with like some of the most profound moments with people some of the most profound moments of their lives have been precisely in them and together looking at the most horrific thing, right? Looking, but I think what it is like, it's always struck me, well, why is that so ecstatic, right? Like there's something extremely ecstatic about it. Yet what we're usually looking at are these moments where they failed, like, or where someone died, like these moments of like where we're sitting together, they're talking about their lives, and like, and we're looking at the most tragic thing. But I think what I kind of got as we're talking about this was, I'm kind of starting to realize like, oh yeah, but it's that we're looking at it. It's like, it's that occurs for us to look at it voluntarily. It communicates something, I think, right?
I mean, I think
That's,
Seneca is so good on this, where he talks about, the trials and the hardships and the adversity, the value of adversity in life. And, you get this sort of Leibnizian, the Voltaire, and you get the Dr. Pangloss with the best of all possible worlds kind of stuff. Again, sort of misinterpreting, I think, what the Stoics were saying, that, to talk about the world being the best of all possible, at least in the ancient Stoic sense, was not that, yeah, the world was always free of hardship and was always, beautiful and wonderful and kind, generous and easy. No, it's that one is able to demonstrate that one has courage, because without real trials, you can't prove that you have it. You can't prove that you're generous without having to actually face the trial of seeing whether or not you're generous. Like when you were talking again about this issue of character and discovering who one is in response, without some of the kinds of just horrible aspects of life,
yeah,
we couldn't discover ourselves as having some of those virtues that we are capable of growing and cultivating and showing.
right, totally. Well, just even becoming like this kind of connection between character and virtue in the virtue sounds like something really simple, but I've noticed when you're thinking about virtue, it's incredibly complex, right? Of like the sense of where is the virtue exactly? Because it, in some sense, it speaks to you from the future, and it calls you to be what could be, but it's always ahead of you in some way. It's just this trippy temporal thing that goes on, but yet it having them is the difference between, well, it's kind of like in some sense has everything to do with the way that you become a character, right?
Yeah.
Having character.
There's so much on this again with Sartre. He says that kind of nothingness secretes itself between my present and my past, so that there isn't any decision in my past that can own the responsibility for my present self having to decide. It's not like, the gambler who has a gambling problem. He can't go, well, yesterday I said I was done gambling, and then rely upon yesterday's decision to carry it out today. There is this sense of transcendence where I'm having to continuously have make it fresh. This is why Wittgenstein says courage is always original. Anytime you're courageous, you're going to have to generate that courage originally again up in this particular situation now.
Right. Wow. This is a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on.
Hey, it was always fun, Guy. I really appreciate it. A lot of
fun. Absolutely. Yeah. I'll put a link to your book in my show notes and stuff like that. And if you want, I'll send you this video if you want to upload it to your channel. I'm sure people would love to see.
Yeah, you want me to?
Upload it to your channel. I'm sure they'd love to see it. Yeah,
I'll post it. And I'll see if I can do a little bit of a real quick. And I'll see if I can shout out for you or something.
Okay, great. Right on. It's good to see you. Let's do it again.
Good to see you. Take care of yourself. Okay, I'll do it again. Okay. Bye. Bye-bye.